Good afternoon, my dear friends. Before anything else reaches you today, before the world asks for your attention, your name, your becoming, pause. Not to gather information, but to remember what information cannot carry. There are truths that do not arrive as explanation, they arrive as recognition. And if something within you quietly leans forward and says, "Yes, I have always known this," verses like Psalm 46:10, "Be still and know that I am God." And so we begin slowly, because the soul does not open under pressure, it opens under stillness. Isaiah 30, verse 15. In returning and rest you shall be saved. In quietness and trust shall be your strength. There is a kind of light that does not announce itself. It does not compete. It does not insist. It simply makes seeing possible. The unfolding of your words give light. It gives understanding to the simple. Psalm 119, verse 130. And perhaps that is what we are truly searching for. Not brightness, not clarity, not spectacle, but direction. Consider Psalm 119, the 105th verse. Your word is a lamp unto my feet and a light to my path. Our story begins before daylight, when the world has not yet decided what it will become. A small town, a quiet road, a farmhouse at the edge of notice, and a lamp, not remarkable in itself, only faithful. And faithfulness, when it endures, begins to feel like something the world cannot ignore. A child notices it, because children still believe repetition must mean purpose. He asks what others have stopped asking. And in that question, something ancient stirs again. Why does any light remain when darkness is so complete? Consider John chapter 1 and verse 5. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. The answer does not come quickly, because some answers are not meant to end inquiry. They are meant to deepen it. Perhaps, the grandfather says, because someone inside remembers what darkness feels like. Then consider Ephesians 5 and verse 8. For you were once darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Walk as children of the light. And suddenly the question is no longer about a house. It is about a memory, about mercy, about refusing to forget what others are still living inside. And so we begin, not with certainty, but with awareness. There are places that do not ask to be remembered, they simply remain. The farmhouse did not demand attention, it did not compete with the world around it. It existed the way ordinary things exist when they are not yet understood. And yet something happens to ordinary things when they are held by steady lives. They begin to gather meaning without permission. Miss Eleanor did not appear remarkable in the way the world measures remarkability. No crowd followed her. No record announced her. No urgency surrounded her name. And yet something in her life resisted disappearance. Then let us look to Hebrews, the 13th chapter and the 16th verse. Do not neglect to do good and to share what you have, for such sacrifices are pleasing to God. She did not seem to become anything. She seemed to be remaining something. And perhaps that is what unsettles us most. Not transformation, but stability. Because stability suggests a center, A center suggests the world is not entirely drifting. The Hebrew writer says in chapter 13 and verse 8, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday and today and forever. She visited the sick, not as duty, but as if presence itself were prayer. Maybe she considered, when visiting, Galatians 6 and verse 2, bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. She remembered names as though names were not small things, but sacred ones. She spoke gently, not because she lacked strength, but because she understood weight. She probably understood the wise man in Proverbs, the 15th chapter, verse 1. A gentle answer turns away wrath. And over time, people stopped describing her actions and began describing her atmosphere. There are lives that do not announce meaning. They accumulate it quietly, unavoidably, until others begin to feel it before they can explain it. Consider Colossians chapter 4 and verse 6. Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt. And then let us move forward. The lamp was not necessary, and yet it was never optional. Proverbs 3, verse 27, do not withhold good from those to whom it is due, when it is in your power to do it. This is where the mind begins to hesitate, because we are trained to ask what is required, not what is faithful. But faithfulness does not always answer necessity. It answers something deeper, something like remembrance. Then, in Deuteronomy, the 32nd chapter, in verse 7, remember the days of old, consider the years of many generations. So she lit the lamp not because darkness demanded it, but because someone might be inside it. And that is the difference. And that difference changes everything. To act because something is needed is practical. To act because someone might be is love. Paul wrote to the Corinthians in his first letter, chapter 13, in verse 4 and 5. Love is patient and kind. It does not insist on its own way. And love is always slightly larger than reason can contain. The child cannot yet hold this. So he returns to the question again and again, as children do when they sense an answer is bigger than language. And the grandfather does not reduce it. He opens Scripture instead. You are the light of the world, Matthew chapter 5, verse 14. For God, who said, let light shine out of darkness, has shone in our hearts. 2 Corinthians 4 and verse 6. But even Scripture, when rushed, can become familiar enough to lose its weight. So he slows it down, not as instruction, but as invitation. Jesus never asked us to become the sun. Let it settle. The true light, which gives light to everyone, was coming into the world, John 1, verse 9. Because the sun is distant, overwhelming, unreachable, but a lamp is near. A lamp can be tended. A lamp can be forgotten. A lamp can be chosen again. Do not quench the spirit. In 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 19. And perhaps that is the truer calling, not to be radiant in theory, but to be faithful in proximity, to remain lit in a world that has learned to live beside darkness. Storms do not create darkness, they reveal it. When I sit in darkness, the Lord will be a light to me, Micah chapter 7 and verse 8. When the power fails, what was always present but ignored becomes suddenly visible. And in that moment, orientation becomes fragile. The world is still there, but it is no longer readable. And then one light remains, not triumphant, not loud, not sufficient in the way we would prefer, but present. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The psalmist wrote in the 27th Psalm, verse 1. And presence, when everything else is uncertain, becomes a kind of mercy. A traveler does not find explanation, he finds direction. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. Proverbs 3, verse 5. And sometimes that is all the soul can hold at once. We imagine guidance as clarity, but often it arrives as something smaller, a point that refuses to disappear, a lamp that does not explain the storm but allows movement within it. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps it always has been enough. And now the question turns inward. And inward questions do not behave gently, because they do not ask what we believe. They ask what we reveal. Examine yourselves to see whether you are in the faith. Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians 13 and verse 5, not what we affirm, but what becomes visible through us without permission. What do others orient themselves toward when they encounter our lives? Not admiration, not agreement, but orientation. Do they find clarity in us, or confusion that lingers after we are gone? Do we make the presence of God easier to perceive or harder to recognize? The words of Christ remain steady. Let your light shine, he says in Matthew, the 5th chapter, in verse 16. But notice what is not said. It does not say, become the light so you are seen. It says, shine in such a way that something beyond you becomes visible. And then he must increase, but I must decrease. John 3 and verse 30. And here is a quiet paradox. The truer light, the less it points to itself. A faithful life does not gather attention. It redirects it. And perhaps maturity is not intensity, but transparency. Not how brightly we burn, but how clearly another can be seen through us. Time passes, houses empty, lamps are removed, and yet something remains that cannot be removed with them. The memory of the righteous is a blessing. The wise man of old said in Proverbs, the 10th chapter and the 7th verse, because what is given was never contained in the object. It was carried in the lives it touched. This is the mystery of influence. It survives its source, not as imitation, but as continuation. Therefore, encourage one another and build one another up. 1 Thessalonians 5 and verse 11. And so the question is no longer whether the lamp still burns in the window. The question becomes, where did its light go? Into whom did it enter? And what did it awaken there? Perhaps discipleship is not the preservation of a single flame, but the multiplication of attentiveness. One's life learning to notice another. One kindness becomes a path. One quiet obedience becoming a pattern others can walk without fear. And in that sense, nothing faithful is ever truly lost. It only changes location. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Paul wrote in Romans 12 and verse 21. So I leave you with something that will not resolve quickly. Let it follow you instead, not as pressure, but as presence. If your life were removed from its setting, If only its effect remained. What would others say they learned about the world from you? Not what you believed, but what you made believable. Not what you said, but what became easier to see because you were there. And if that question feels too large, do not rush to shrink it. Sit with it. Ponder on it. Because some questions are not meant to be answered, they are meant to reshape the one who carries them. Search me, O God, and know my heart, the psalmist wrote in Psalms 139 and verse 23. Until we meet again, do not strive to be impressive. Strive to be faithful. For faithfulness is simply light that has learned to remain. Well done, good and faithful servant, it says in Matthew 25 and verse 21. And even the smallest light, when it refuses to go out, becomes a kind of hope the darkness cannot fully explain. May you walk gently today, and may something in you remain lit. This is Nathan Hampton, a minister in the Lord's church. As we go forward until we meet again, let us consider and ponder on the scriptures in which we read, not rushing, but pondering. Thank you for joining me, and goodbye.